again, everyone. Welcome to the Aldersgate Experience, the podcast of Aldersgate Church in York, Pennsylvania. I'm Pastor Bob Kaler.
I'm Pastor Jeff Markey.
We started a new series.
We did. It's the long walk on the Gospel of Luke.
We're going to be taking a long journey through the Gospel of Luke over the course of the next 22 weeks. And I think Luke is a great place to start because we have the first Sunday of Advent coming up this week. And we kind of did an introduction this past Sunday on Luke and the introductory verses there to Luke, which he addresses to Theophilus, the friend of God. And we're going to be diving into, during Advent, we're going to be diving into what I think are the first four Christmas carols. You have Mary's song, the Magnificat. You have Zachariah's, which is the Benedictus. You have the Gloria from the angels. And then you have what's called the Nunc Dimittis, or the Now Your Servant Departs in Peace from Simeon. So those four are kind of are a frame of Luke chapters 1 and 2 and are great Advent texts. But we started this week just by getting into an overall introduction to, one, who is Luke, and two, really, what is a gospel?
Yeah, and you started off really kind of laying some good groundwork, some good foundation, because you talked about the geographical element that you said Jesus, within his 3 years of ministry, likely traveled about 3,000 miles by foot. Yeah, I mean that's quite a lot. And of course, as you laid out the series and really looking at all of Luke, he has really 5 great travels throughout that.
There's several. I mean, I think that the big turn is in Luke chapter 9, where he sets his face toward Jerusalem, and the whole narrative is moving toward there. And you could argue it's moving toward there from the very beginning, because we get some foreshadowing of that even in the first couple of chapters about what's going to happen. Simeon foreshadows that for Mary, in some sense. So there's a lot of movement going on, but you've got the journey to Bethlehem. You've got the travels of Jesus around Galilee, leaving Nazareth and creating a new home base, and in effect, a new family for several chapters. And then you have that great turn toward Jerusalem.
Right.
You have then in Jerusalem that journey that goes from Palm Sunday to the cross and the resurrection. And then you have the ending of Luke, which is that great story of the walk to Emmaus. And it's kind of an onward journey that's going to take us then into the book of Acts, where that journey is actually going to go with those disciples worldwide. Yeah.
Now, this particular message that you shared, you started really talking about Israel and taking that time, being there and really taking the steps that Jesus walked. I mean, you also talked about Luke himself, and you talked about just kind of the theological understanding of where Luke may have gotten his source information. So some really interesting stuff, but you talked about when you were in the Holy Land, that you called it the fifth gospel.
Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting. What changed for you once you actually walked where Jesus walked?
Well, I'd always wanted to go, and I went on a trip by myself with a group of pastors it was a couple decades ago, and just fell in love with it, because once you're there and the places you've read about and pictured in your mind, now you've seen them for real. Now, in truth, you're in proximate locations, for the most of it. We don't know for sure. You hear a lot of this in Israel, and people will say that they want to stand on the very spot that Jesus stood. Well, that's not always possible, because usually the spot where Jesus stood is about 12 feet underground.
That's true.
From where you are standing.
Talk about 2,000 years. It's a big difference.
Yeah, but you're getting in the place where you can envision the hills, for example, the sights, the sounds, the smells, walking through the streets of the old city. It's not exactly the same, but it does give you that sense of being in this place where all these cultures mold together. You've got that. You've got everything from Hasidic Jews there in Jerusalem, for example, to Muslims and people from Arab descent. All these different things are all coming together in that place. So there's a lot of history. There's a lot of layers of things. Even just looking like at the temple complex, you can see from the stone layers from Herod all the way up until, post-World War I and the Ottoman Empire, all that kind of stuff. It's just, it's a really fascinating mix of things. But when you're at the Sea of Galilee, you put your toes in the Sea of Galilee, you're at a place where Jesus was. Maybe not that exact spot, but that's where where he was. You have the Mount of Beatitudes, the traditional site where Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount. Did he give the Sermon on the Mount in one place at one time? We don't know. I think Matthew's trying to tell us that this is like Moses because he's writing a Jewish gospel. And so the word is given from the mountain, like Moses brought it down from the mountain. There's a lot of symbolism, but there's also real places. Like you can walk in Capernaum. You can stand in the synagogue that's referenced in the first couple chapters of Luke. And you can see the layer underneath where the original synagogue was. So there are places that you can go where you're like, yeah, Jesus was definitely here.
Wow.
But you're just in that place. And so they call it the fifth gospel because it puts things in three dimensions.
Yeah.
The things that you read in the text, it's hard to get a picture of it in your mind. But when you're there, now automatically those things come to light.
You already know he's been here, and that's incredible. Now I've never been to the Holy Land.
And I don't think you have to go in order to have that kind of experience. I mean, lots of people have gone. If you get a chance to go, it's phenomenal. I've been 7 times.
Yeah.
And always learn something new when I go. But I don't think it's a prerequisite for understanding what's going on here. Part of what I want to do in this series is to bring some of that to bear, to be able to show people pictures and give them a sense of what it's like in some of those places. But really the focus is on the text and what's going on with the text.
I was just going to say, that's the whole purpose of this whole sermon series is to kind of really think about where you'd be in relation to Jesus. And then as you go through the texts, we can bring that to life as well through the sermon time and the excitement there.
Yeah, one of the big questions that permeates the Gospel of Luke, and I think the Gospels in general, is the question, who is this?
Yeah.
Who is this person? Jesus.
Yeah.
Is he the Messiah? And if so, what kind of Messiah is he? There are a lot of questions that are being raised throughout, and they don't get answered until the end. And the answer is not always satisfying to everyone because no one seems to connect messiahship to the cross.
Yeah.
And so there's a gradual kind of revelation of who Jesus is. Now in Luke, he comes out and he sets his agenda, and then he begins to walk through it.
Yeah.
And that causes people to go, well, we thought the Messiah was going to be this. And there are a lot of times that our expectations get in the way. And so that's one of the things that I think is great about studying a gospel like this is that we can start with a blank slate and say, okay, how did these people perceive who Jesus was?
Yeah.
We know theologically and so forth, but it invites us to ask the question, who is Jesus to me now?
Yeah.
And what does that mean for me? And how would I be in the midst of this if I was experiencing these things? Would I have gotten it? We all think, oh, certainly we would have identified that Jesus was the Son of God and the Messiah and all that kind of thing. Maybe not.
Yeah.
Not until we see the resurrected Christ.
Right.
Not until we actually start to walk with him. Because remember, it's the people who walk with him the whole way that are the ones who get the revelation.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's necessary. And I think we see crowds of people gathering for teaching, gathering for healing. Where were they as Christ set his
the more Jesus talked, the fewer people hung around.
Exactly.
That's part of the deal.
The deeper the relationship, the deeper the understanding, the deeper the sacrifice, the willingness. So you contrast kind of tour bus reading, because obviously, you mentioned in your message, you have a tour bus that'll drop you down in one part of the gospel, drop you down in a completely different part, maybe even in the Old Testament, not necessarily looking at the whole. And that's why this particular message series is on that long walk. You want to really take your time and walk with Jesus through that. So what is slowing down to help us see in the Gospels that we often would miss if we just did that kind of spot by spot?
I think it's transitions and connecting points. There are a lot of different ways to preach through texts. So, for example, there's the lectionary, where in a 3-year cycle you're reading through the Bible, but every Sunday you get an Old Testament reading, a Psalm, a New Testament reading, and a Gospel reading.
Right.
And those are prescribed. Here's your text for the week. And that's a really great text because it forces you to get into some things that you might not otherwise.
It does, yeah.
But it also jumps around a lot. Mm-hmm. So you're looking at a particular text. Like we're going to look at, let's say we're going to go to Luke 15. We're going to look at the story of the prodigal son. A lot of times we will jump into that text and then we'll jump back out of it and we'll go to something else.
Right.
Or a sermon series is thematic, and it'll be like the last one we did was very much a theological sermon series on the Wesleyan way.
Good. Rich.
Yeah, and important. And all of these approaches are extremely important. I've used all of them myself.
Valid.
But there's something about going through a gospel as a whole or any book of the Bible as a whole that allows you to see all the connective tissue and how things fit together and how things build on one another and how these themes loop back on one another again and again. Now, there's another type of preaching called expository, which goes through it verse by verse. And that's a valid approach as well. Although for me, I think the Bible's not written that way. It's written to be read as a whole, which is one of the reasons why we invited people to start reading the whole gospel before we start diving into the pieces.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes we can lose the forest for the trees. But I want to be able to take sections of Luke, and we're not going to hit every one of the sections in the sermons.
Yeah.
But that's why I want to use this time, and also the blog.
You're going to use your blog,
the Substack blog, in order to kind of fill in some of those gaps and explore some of those themes. Like when Jesus is talking about Herod, for example, or when Luke's referring to Herod, which Herod? You have to keep your Herods straight. There's a historical background and context. Who's Caesar Augustus? Why is that important? Why does Luke mention him? Because none of the other Gospels mention Caesar Augustus. Why is that important? There are things like that we want to bring into this. So for me, this allows me, because this is my wiring, to come at this as both a preacher and a historian.
Yeah.
And I think Luke is both a preacher and a historian. So we're kind of kindred spirits in that sense. So this is that's why it's one of my favorite texts to kind of work through, because you can see him with an eye for detail. He's also borrowing from other sources, but he's trying to interpret them in a way that's going to communicate to Theophilus, to the friend or friends of God who are reading this text.
Yeah.
So I love this long, slow process of going through it.
Yeah.
And if we do it right, most of the time when you're teaching preaching, and I've done that before, when you get into sermon series, you say, well, try not to do any more than 6 to 8 weeks because people get bored, with the same theme. I think what really happens is the preacher gets bored,
That's
with that.
Probably true, yeah.
But I do think that when you're really focusing on a particular text and you're doing it right, there's always something new that's going to emerge that makes you want to go deeper and more.
Yeah.
And I started about 6 months ago working through Luke section by section and making my own notes and things like that. And even right now, I'm only up through chapter 9.
That's wonderful.
So there's always new stuff that I think I shared some in staff meeting today. We had staff prayer today, and we were talking about some stuff that I was like, whoa, this is really cool. So so my hope is that this long walk will allow us to get into this story in a way that people may not have done before.
Yeah, and there's a wealth of information, especially when you get into the parables that Jesus teaches. And
they're unique to Luke.
Exactly. They're unique to Luke, and they're unique to that situation that Jesus possibly is speaking to a specific audience that needs to hear this type of parable that they may not hear, from other Gospels and whatnot. So can you tell me a little bit about that Jesus trail hike that you took? What moment from that journey still shapes you how you read Luke?
Well, it was an interesting experience.
Yeah.
Having been to the Holy Land a lot, to get on the ground and walk and to have encounters with people outside of the tourist kind of mode.
Yeah.
When you jump off the bus somewhere, there's always vendors and they're grabbing at you, here, we'll sell you these postcards for $1 or whatever. But when you're hiking along, you're kind of vulnerable and you're really being immersed in the landscape. You're not in control.
No.
You can't just jump on the bus and go to the next thing. So you're hiking along, you're seeing both the really good stuff and you're seeing some of the not so good stuff in a particular place. But you're really getting a feel for pace. That when you're walking along these ways, and because the Gospels, we it's like watching a TV show, a jump cut. I'm going from here to here. Mark is especially like that. Immediately they went here, boom, now we're in a new place.
Yes.
But to recognize there's a lot of stuff that happens in between. And as you're going along, as Jesus is walking along, and Luke does this all the time, he says, once Jesus saw X. It's like, here's all these stories that are just kind of jumbled together. They're not necessarily in chronological order in many ways, but they are encounters that happen because you're going slowly through the landscape.
Yeah.
And we had stories all over the place about people that we encountered. The night that we spent in the Arab hostel in Cana and had dinner with an Arab family. They didn't speak English. Their daughter did. She was the innkeeper. She was translating for us. And, the house got packed because my friend Chris from Kentucky, he has that Southern accent a little bit, and he looks a little bit like Bill Clinton. And for whatever reason, Israeli Arabs love Bill Clinton. So they had him do his Bill Clinton impression. And the whole village came and crammed into the house to hear. But we had the most amazing meal that night, and just great conversation through Marwa's interpretation. And that's something I'll never forget.
Wow.
Or hiking up to the top of the Horns of Hattin and being in that place where not only do you have biblical history, but you also have the Crusader. There's a great Crusader battle fought there.
Wow.
And you're looking out over Mount Arbel and the Sea of Galilee and all these places where Jesus would have walked, these high places when it says he escaped to the mountain. And this might have been right where he sat when he did it. So there's something really powerful about seeing things at that pace.
Yeah.
That and feeling the fatigue.
Yeah.
Of walking in that way. We did about 10 miles a day, which is not much, but that gives you time to kind of mosey along the way. And we stopped in a lot of different places along the way.
Yeah.
So I'm going to tell some of those stories, but I really was richly blessed by the experience because one, I love to hike, and so does my wife, and we like to do that together. But it was really seeing things from the ground level just gives you a completely different perspective than a tourist bus can give you.
Well, and you mentioned also in your message that when you're walking with someone, the stories and the conversations, you really get to know people.
Yes.
And I can imagine Jesus' disciples as they're going from place to place, spending days on the road together. What those disciples experienced with that fellowship with Christ, I can only imagine what kind of teachings they would have been exposed to.
Yeah, you get all kinds of conversations, and you see them, in the Gospels where the disciples are arguing about who's the greatest.
Yeah, that's kind of funny.
I'm just walking along and saying, I was thinking about which one of us is the greatest, and that just spawns this conversation. And then Jesus turns and goes, "What are you guys talking about?"
Whoever wants to be the greatest.
He knows exactly what he's talking about. Oh, here comes another lesson. We were just busting on each other here, and Chris and I are good friends. We did our doctoral work together. We're both seminary guys, that we went to school together. So we've had this we joked around a lot, and that was part of the fun of it too. Hiking with my wife in Scotland, that was just a great experience for us, bonding together. There are just things like that you can't replace.
No.
Because there's nothing there but conversation. Your phone's away, all that stuff. You're just walking and you're experiencing the same things together.
Yeah,
so
yeah. Well, and it wouldn't surprise me if Jesus, told the disciples, take nothing with you. One, it could be expediency, because if they're taking nothing with them, then they have nothing to slow them down. But two, for this very same purpose, you're not distracted, and you have an opportunity to have that fellowship together.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. So movement obviously is a major theme in Luke. Someone is always on the road doing something. What does this theme of journey teach modern disciples? How can we learn from that?
Well, I think it teaches us that discipleship itself is a long walk with Jesus.
Yeah.
Eugene Peterson would call it a long, slow obedience in the same direction.
No shortcuts.
There's a lot, and you see the disciples learning along the way, and Jesus setting the conditions for that. You know, in chapter 9, for example, there are people who want to follow Jesus. He said, well, you know, you can't have it both ways.
Right.
I need to go bury my father first. Well, let the dead bury their own dead.
Yeah.
That seems harsh, but Jesus is saying this is a forward movement.
Yeah.
It's not a retrograde movement. You always have to be moving ahead. And so when we talk about our walk with Jesus, and that's a popular way to put it, well, that's both literal and figurative in the sense that we're being shaped. The more that we spend time with Jesus, the more we're being shaped by him.
Yeah.
And the more time we spend in the Gospels, the more time we spend in the Scriptures with him, the more we become shaped like him. So we're walking with him through this text, through this story in a way that is really going to be transformational.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you mentioned the most excellent Theophilus, and I've heard it both ways. I've heard it that, you know, he could be speaking to someone specific, but it also could be anybody who's interested in the text. Who do you think Theophilus represents?
It seems to me that he's writing to a particular person.
Yeah.
It's a very common name. It's a Greek rendering of a name that was pretty common in the ancient world. But I don't think it matters.
Yeah.
You know, we always try to identify who this is. Luke obviously has the time and means to be able to write, which is not a common thing in the ancient world. So Theophilus might have been his patron who said, you know, I'm going to commission you to write this, or he may be a prominent person within the church who wants to know the story, or he might be someone at a distance that Luke wants to connect with.
Yeah.
We're not sure about that. Yeah, we do know that he addresses both the Gospel of Luke and Acts to Theophilus.
Yeah.
So it's like volume 1 and volume 2. But whether it's one person or whether it's representative, you know, like Dear Reader or something like that, the effect is the same. And the idea is to, as he says, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you've been taught. So he's filling in gaps. Because remember, there's a lot of oral tradition about Jesus going around. You have these earlier Gospels, probably Mark, circulating by this point. You've got other traditions that are starting to circle. And so Luke's trying to say, let me fill in the holes for you, because you may have only gotten part of the story.
Wow. Yeah. And I mean, I honestly have always thought, does it really matter? If it's in the scripture, obviously I need to listen to it. I need to heed it, whether or not it's the Theophilus, a person. Does it really matter? Not really. Really, what is it for? It's for me, right?
Yeah.
It's for me.
Yeah.
So, you encouraged the congregation to read all of Luke. You said it's about an hour and a half if you read it in one sitting. What do you think people tend to notice when they read it straight through, like you're suggesting?
Well, we don't often do that.
Yeah.
We don't often read through a biblical book like we would a regular book, because, well, we know the story. You know, I'm good. I already know how it ends.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. I know how it ends.
Jesus rose from the dead.
But I think what you begin to see, like I said earlier, when you read through, you start to see themes emerge. You start to see patterns emerge.
Yeah.
The language picks it up in a different way. And in fact, reading it at different translations helps with that. Different English translations helps with that. The rhythm of how the writer is picking up those themes, what he chooses to include and what he doesn't.
Yeah.
Because as you read, you'll think, well, that's different than the way it's phrased in Mark, or the way it's phrased in Matthew,
right.
or the way the story of the feeding of the 5,000 is told in John, because that's one story that's common to all four Gospels.
Right.
So you'll start to perk up and say, wow, why does he make that choice? Or why are these things in this order? But I think it gives you a full sweep of the story. Like, who is Jesus? If I'm reading this for the very first time, what impression am I getting of who this Jesus is?
Yeah.
And so it gives you a fresh perspective to be able to read as a whole.
Yeah. We understand Luke likely was a doctor, right? And very, very formulaic, especially when it comes to things of when we understand Christ's suffering, what he dealt with on the cross. Luke comes into some pretty strong details on that, but also writing generally to a Gentile audience, correct? Mm-hmm. And so based on, you talked about the four source theory.
Right.
So we see Mark is likely the main source we get to Matthew and Luke, but then there's also this Quella, right? It's a German term. So obviously with Luke writing to the Gentile audience, he's going to choose different things to highlight versus Matthew, who's generally writing to more of a Jewish audience. Did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think for example, Matthew starts out by talking about Herod the Great, and you have the story of the Magi. So you have Jesus born in Bethlehem, city of David. Herod finds out from the Magi who come from the east, and they're Gentiles actually, and they come from the east. They're seeking the star. They're seeking the child. They come and worship him. Probably 2 years after Jesus is born. It's always interesting that we put the Magi and the shepherds in the same scene because they're two different gospels, two different time periods. Mm-hmm. But then Herod wants to kill all the babies in Bethlehem because they're a threat to him.
Right.
And so where do Mary and Joseph escape? To Egypt. And then the next scene, they're coming out of Egypt. And then in Matthew chapter 3, Jesus is going through the water of baptism and immediately into the desert for 40 days. And then by chapter 5, Jesus is giving the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
So who is this kind of reflecting? It's kind of like Jesus is the new Moses.
Right, exactly.
And so we get the sense. Matthew's explaining things from a Torah perspective in many ways. Whereas Luke downplays that, although he does have a lot of Old Testament connection, particularly here in the first 2 chapters, starting with Zechariah and Elizabeth, faithful old priest and his wife, barren couple, really connects us back to the story of Abraham. And then you have the song of Mary, which sounds very much like the song of Hannah in 1 Samuel.
Yeah. So
there are a lot of Old Testament connections, but they're more subtle. So for example, when Jesus raises Jairus' daughter, in Matthew, I think it's Matthew and Mark. I'd have to look at it again, but they list the Aramaic Talitha cum, little girl, get up. Yeah. Luke eliminates that altogether because he assumes his audience doesn't know anything about Aramaic.
Yeah.
Aramaic, by the way, being the common language of the people. The religious language was Hebrew. Aramaic, the common language. Greek, then sort of the lingua franca of the empire.
Right.
So you've got little details like that tell you, and there are women featuring prominently in Luke's gospel. The poor are featured prominently in Luke's gospel. All those kinds of things. So,
wow.
So anyway, there's a lot more to it, and we'll get through that as we go forward.
Excellent. So as we begin this walk together, what is your deepest hope for the congregation in this season?
I want you to grow deeper in fellowship with Jesus, and I want people to experience real deep study and deep engagement with the scriptures to really fall in love with wanting to go deeper in the Bible.
Wow.
So my hope is that this will help us not only to know the scriptures, but also to really begin to embrace our vision of helping people to know, live, and share Jesus.
Yeah,
because I think all of that is contained in Luke.
Well, it's very exciting. I'm very excited about this sermon series. If you have any questions, you can reach out to communications@aldersgateyork.com. You can also please comment below. We'd love to reply back with whatever questions you might have.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you back here again on the Aldersgate Experience.
God bless.